On the morning of September 17, 1978, a maintenance worker named Vincent Caruso descended into the basement of St. Catherine's Convent on Mulberry Street to fix a broken boiler and discovered something that would shatter the careful silence of an entire neighborhood. Behind a false panel in the coal room, concealed by decades of grime and deliberate neglect, he found a wooden trunk sealed with wax and bound with rosary beads. Inside were 9 baptismal certificates, all dated between 1971 and 1977, each bearing the same father's name written in careful script, Salvatore Benedetto Russo. Beside each certificate lay a small leather prayer book, and pressed between the pages of each book was a single photograph. 9 different women in 9 different stages of pregnancy, all wearing the same distinctive silver crucifix. All 9 were nuns of the Order of St. Catherine, and all 9 children, according to the certificates, had been surrendered to adoption agencies across 3 states within hours of birth. The photographs were not hidden in shame. They were preserved like relics. This is not a story about hypocrisy. This is not a story about a predator who exploited faith or women who broke their vows in weakness. This is a story about a community that built an entire theology around a single man, a belief system so complete and so internally coherent that 9 women could carry his children, deliver them in secret, and return to their prayers without ever believing they had sinned. This is a story about how devotion, when unmoored from institutional oversight, creates its own sacraments. And this is a story about Salvatore Russo, a man who killed for the Genovese crime family by night and heard confessions by appointment in a convent basement by day, who became for 9 women not a lover but a living conduit to the divine. Before we continue, I need you to understand something about Little Italy in the late 1960s. If you grew up there, if your family lived on those narrow streets between Canal and Houston, you knew the architecture of silence. You knew which storefronts were fronts, which basements held card games that ran until dawn, which men commanded respect without ever raising their voices. You knew that the church and the neighborhood were not separate institutions, but interwoven threads of the same fabric, that a man could attend morning mass and evening sit-downs with equal devotion, that morality was not about law, but about loyalty. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, which city, which neighborhood. Tell me if you remember when the boundaries between sacred and profane were not lines but permeable membranes, when a man's reputation could rest equally on his piety and his capacity for violence. To understand how 9 nuns came to share one man, to bear his children, and to call it holy, we must go back to a winter night in 1964, to a tenement apartment on Hester Street, where a young Salvatore Russo knelt beside his dying mother's bed. Salvatore was 23 years old. He had already killed 2 men, both sanctioned by the family, both executed with the clinical precision that would become his signature. His mother, Concetta, had been a seamstress for the convent of St. Catherine, mending habits and altar cloths for 30 years. In her final hours, delirious with fever, she gripped her son's hand and whispered a confession that would reshape the architecture of his soul. She told him that she had once been a novice herself, that she had left the convent pregnant with him, that his father had been a priest who died before Salvatore was born. She told him that her greatest sin was not the pregnancy, but the leaving, that she had abandoned her vocation for the world and had suffered every day since. She made him promise, there in that dim room smelling of camphor and candle wax, that he would find a way to serve God that she never could. 3 days after her funeral, Salvatore walked into St. Catherine's and asked to speak with the Mother Superior. The convent in those years was led by Mother Agnese Torini, a woman in her 60s who had survived Mussolini's Italy and the crossing to America in steerage, who ran the convent with the efficiency of a field general and the tenderness of a combat nurse. She knew the Russo family. She knew what Salvatore did for a living. When he sat across from her in the small parlor and told her about his mother's dying wish, she did not recoil. She studied him with eyes that had seen men lie and men tell terrible truths, and she said, "Your mother was a good woman who made an impossible choice. If you want to honor her, you don't do it by pretending to be something you're not. You do it by bringing what you are into the service of something larger." What followed was an arrangement that began as pastoral and became sacramental. Mother Agnese proposed that Salvatore become a lay confessor for the convent, an unofficial spiritual director for the nuns who struggled with doubts, with loneliness, with the weight of vows that sometimes felt like stones. The church had its priests, but priests came and went, and many of the younger nuns found it difficult to confess their deepest fears to men who had never lived in the world, who had never known hunger or violence or the particular loneliness of women enclosed. Salvatore, Mother Agnese reasoned, had lived. He understood sin not as abstraction, but as lived experience. He could offer something the church could not, the confession of a man who had done terrible things and still believed in grace. Salvatore agreed. He began coming to the convent twice a week, entering through the basement door after dark, sitting in a small room that had once been a storage closet. The nuns came to him one by one, and he listened. He did not absolve them. He had no authority to do that, but he heard them. He asked questions. He offered not penance, but perspective, the hard-earned wisdom of a man who had looked into the abyss and chosen, each day, to turn back toward the light. And the nuns, isolated and hungry for a spiritual intimacy their vows denied them, began to see him not as a criminal, but as a prophet. The first was Sister Lucia Benedetti, 29 years old, who had entered the convent at 18 to escape an arranged marriage and had spent 11 years wondering if she had traded one prison for another. She came to Salvatore in the winter of 1965, 6 months after he began his visits, and confessed that she no longer felt God's presence, that her prayers felt like words spoken into a void, that she feared she had wasted her life. Salvatore listened, and then he told her about the men he had killed. He described the weight of the gun, the sound of the body falling, the way silence rushed in after violence. He told her that he prayed before every job, that he asked God not for forgiveness, but for clarity, for the strength to carry the weight of what he was about to do. He told her that faith was not the absence of doubt, but the choice to act as if God were present even when you felt nothing. Sister Lucia wept, and then she asked him to pray with her. They knelt together in that small room, and Salvatore placed his hand on her head the way he had seen priests do, and he spoke a prayer he invented in the moment, a prayer that asked God to make her emptiness a vessel, her doubt a doorway. When he finished, Sister Lucia looked at him with an expression he would see again and again in the years to come. Not gratitude, but recognition, as if she had finally found the language for something she had always known. She came back the next week, and the week after that. And within 6 months, the other nuns began to ask Mother Agnese if they too could speak with the man in the basement. By 1967, Salvatore was hearing confessions from 9 nuns on a rotating schedule. He knew their fears, their shames, their secret rebellions against the rule. He knew that Sister Teresa had stolen food from the kitchen to feed stray cats. He knew that Sister Margherita wrote poetry in the margins of her breviary. He knew that Sister Rosaria dreamed of running away to California, of learning to surf, of living a life unbound by bells and schedules. He became the repository of their hidden selves, and in return, they made him holy. The transformation was gradual and total. The nuns began to speak of Salvatore not by name, but as the listener, and later simply as him, the pronoun weighted with reverence. They began to interpret his words not as advice, but as revelation. When Sister Lucia struggled with anger toward the Mother Superior, Salvatore told her, "Anger is just love that has nowhere to go. Find a way to let it move." She took this as a commandment and began scrubbing the convent floors at midnight, channeling her rage into labor until her hands bled. When Sister Teresa confessed her fear of death, Salvatore said, "Death is just God asking you to trust him one more time." She carved the phrase into the underside of her prayer desk and meditated on it daily. They began to ask him to bless objects, rosaries, prayer books, small vials of water from the convent well. He refused at first, but Mother Agnesa, who watched all of this with a mixture of concern and fascination, told him, "If it brings them peace, let them have it. God works through stranger vessels than you, so he blessed their objects. He made the sign of the cross over their foreheads. He invented rituals, small, private ceremonies that borrowed from the church, but belonged to no official liturgy." Before long, the nuns began to see these rituals not as supplements to their faith, but as the center of it. And then, in the spring of 1968, Sister Lucia asked him a question that changed everything. She came to him after Compline, her face pale, her hands trembling. She knelt before him and said, "I want to give myself to God completely, but I don't know how. The vows feel like walls. I want to be broken open. I want to be remade. Can you help me?" Salvatore understood what she was asking. He had seen it in her eyes for months. The way she looked at him not with desire, but with a kind of spiritual hunger, as if he were not a man but a doorway. He knew that what she wanted was not sex, but annihilation, the dissolution of the self that mystics described, the union with the divine that required the destruction of the ego. He also knew that he could give it to her. He told her to return the following week, to come to the basement at midnight, to tell no one. She obeyed. When she arrived, he had prepared the room. He had covered the floor with white sheets. He had lit candles in a circle. He had brought wine and bread, not consecrated, but ordinary, purchased from the corner store. He told her to remove her habit and to kneel in the center of the circle, and she did, without hesitation, without shame. He anointed her forehead with oil, her wrists, the hollow of her throat. He spoke prayers he had written himself, prayers that invoked not the Trinity, but the idea of God as consuming fire, as the force that unmakes and remakes. And then he told her that to be remade, she must first be emptied, that to be filled with God, she must first be emptied of herself. What happened next, Salvatore would later describe in a journal he kept hidden in his apartment, was not sex, but sacrament. He wrote, "She did not come to me as a woman comes to a man. She came as a penitent comes to the altar, and I did not take her. I offered her the only thing I had, my body as a vessel for her transformation. When it was over, she wept and said she had felt God enter her. I believed her." Sister Lucia returned to her cell before dawn. She told no one. But 2 months later, she came to Salvatore again and told him she was pregnant. He expected fear. He expected regret. Instead, she smiled. She said, "This is the proof. This is the sign that God accepted the offering." Salvatore did not argue. He had been raised in a world where belief was stronger than fact. where the story you told yourself determined the reality you lived. If Sister Lucia believed that her pregnancy was not a sin but a miracle, who was he to say otherwise? He asked her what she wanted to do. She said, "I want to carry the child. I want to give birth. And then I want to give the child to God, the way Hannah gave Samuel." Mother Agnese, when she learned of the pregnancy, did not expel Sister Lucia. She did not call the authorities. She arranged for the nun to be sent to a convent in upstate New York, a place where pregnant women, unmarried, desperate, shamed, went to deliver their children in secret. Sister Lucia gave birth to a boy in January of 1969. She held him for 1 hour. She named him Samuel, and then she signed the papers that released him to a Catholic adoption agency, and she returned to St. Catherine's, and she resumed her prayers. She told the other nuns what had happened, not as a confession, but as a testimony. Within a year, 3 more nuns had come to Salvatore at midnight. Within 2 years, 5 more. Each came seeking the same thing Sister Lucia had sought. Not pleasure, not escape, but a way to touch the divine through the destruction of the self. Each became pregnant. Each gave birth in secret. Each surrendered the child and returned to the convent. And each spoke of the experience not as a fall, but as an ascension. The theology they constructed around Salvatore was intricate and internally consistent. They did not see him as Christ. That would have been blasphemy. They saw him as a John the Baptist figure, a forerunner, a man whose very brokenness made him a conduit. They believed that his violence, his sin, had hollowed him out, had made him a vessel that could hold the sacred without being consumed by it. They believed that by giving themselves to him, they were not breaking their vows, but fulfilling them, because they were giving themselves not to a man, but to the God who worked through him. They kept meticulous records. Each nun, after her midnight ritual, wrote a letter to the child she would bear, a letter that explained the theology, the love, the sacrifice. These letters were placed in the trunk, along with the baptismal certificates and the photographs. They were not hidden in shame. They were preserved as evidence of a new gospel, a by-may secret revelation that belonged only to them. Salvatore, for his part, continued his other life. He killed when the family required it. He attended Mass on Sundays. He visited his mother's grave and left flowers. He lived in 2 worlds, and he kept them separate with the discipline of a man who understood that survival required compartmentalization. But in his journal, he wrote, "I do not know if what we are doing is holy or damned. I know only that they believe it is holy, and their belief has made me something I was not. I am no longer just a killer. I am a priest of a church that has no name, a servant of a God I do not fully understand." The arrangement continued for 7 years. 9 nuns, 9 pregnancies, 9 children surrendered to adoption, scattered across the country, raised by families who knew nothing of their origins. The convent became a kind of secret cathedral, a place where the official liturgy of the church coexisted with a shadow liturgy known only to the initiated. Mother Agnese, who had facilitated the first meeting, watched it all unfold with a mixture of horror and awe. She did not stop it. She could not. The nuns were happier than she had ever seen them. They prayed with a fervor that bordered on ecstasy. They served the poor with a dedication that shamed the diocesan priests. They had found something that the Church, for all its sacraments and saints, had failed to give them, a faith that felt alive. But in 1977, the architecture of silence began to crack. A young priest named Father Daniel Cormack was assigned to St. Catherine's as chaplain. He was 28 years old, fresh from seminary, earnest and idealistic, and utterly unprepared for what he would find. He noticed things. He noticed that the nuns spoke of a man they called the listener with a reverence usually reserved for saints. He noticed that certain nuns disappeared for days at a time and returned pale and quiet. He noticed the basement door, always locked, and the way the nuns avoided his questions about what lay beyond it. He began to investigate. He asked questions in the neighborhood. He learned that Salvatore Russo was a known associate of the Genovese family, that he had a reputation for efficiency and discretion, that he was feared and respected in equal measure. Father Cormac could not reconcile this information with the nuns' devotion. He confronted Mother Agnesa. She told him everything. Father Cormac was appalled. He saw not a miracle, but a systematic abuse, a manipulation of vulnerable women by a man who had weaponized their loneliness. He demanded that Mother Agnese report Salvatore to the police, to the diocese, to anyone who would listen. Mother Agnese refused. She said, "You see sin because you are looking for it. They see grace because they have lived it. Who are you to tell them they are wrong?" Father Cormac went to the diocese anyway. He filed a formal complaint. He provided names, dates, details. The diocese, horrified and desperate to avoid scandal, launched a quiet investigation. They interviewed the nuns, they examined the records, and they discovered the trunk, the photographs, the baptismal certificates, the letters. The diocese faced a choice: expose the scandal and destroy the convent, or bury it and preserve the institution. They chose burial. They sealed the investigation. They transferred Father Cormac to a parish in Alaska. They reassigned Mother Agnesa to a contemplative order in New Mexico. They closed St. Catherine's Convent, citing structural concerns, and dispersed the nuns to convents across the country, ensuring that they would never speak to one another again. Salvatore Russo was never charged. The diocese did not want the publicity. The Genovese family, when they learned what had happened, did not punish him. They understood that in their world, as in the convent, loyalty mattered more than morality. But Salvatore stopped visiting the convent. He stopped hearing confessions. He continued to kill when required, but he did so with a mechanical detachment that his associates noticed and worried about. He began drinking heavily. He stopped attending Mass. In 1982, he was found dead in his apartment on Hester Street, a single gunshot wound to the head, the gun in his hand. The official ruling was suicide. His journal, discovered by the police, was never made public. It was turned over to the diocese and placed in a sealed archive, where it remains to this day. The 9 children, now adults, know nothing of their origins. The adoption records were sealed. The nuns who bore them have never spoken publicly about what happened. Some have died. Some have left religious life. Some remain in convents, praying the hours, keeping the silence. Vincent Caruso, the maintenance worker who found the trunk, tried to tell the story. He went to newspapers, to local television stations. No one would run it. The diocese issued a statement denying any knowledge of impropriety at St. Catherine's. The story died, but the trunk still exists. It was not destroyed. It was placed in the basement of the diocesan archives, in a room that requires special permission to access, in a box labeled St. Catherine's Convent, miscellaneous, do not catalog. I have seen the photographs, I have read the letters, and I have spoken to one of the nuns, now in her 70s, living in a small apartment in Queens, who agreed to talk on the condition of anonymity. She told me, "People will say we were abused. They will say we were brainwashed. But I was there. I lived it. And I am telling you, I have never felt closer to God than I did in that basement. I have never felt more loved. The child I bore, the child I gave away. I think about him every day. I pray for him every day. And I do not regret it. I cannot regret it. Because if I regret it, then it was all for nothing. And I cannot live in a world where it was all for nothing. When I asked her if she believed Salvatore Russo was holy, she paused for a long time. Then she said, "I believe he was broken in a way that let the light through. I believe God uses broken things, and I believe that what we did, what we chose, was an act of faith so complete that the world has no language for it. So they call it scandal, they call it abuse. But we called it love. How does a man who kills for a living become a vessel for the sacred? What kind of faith transforms pregnancy into sacrament, surrender into devotion? And how did 9 women, bound by vows of chastity, come to believe that bearing the children of a hitman was not a betrayal of God, but a path toward him? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the questions that haunt every attempt to understand what happened at St. Catherine's Convent between 1964 and 1977. And they are questions that resist easy answers, because they require us to confront the possibility that faith, when lived at its extremes, creates its own reality, its own morality, its own truth. The official narrative is simple. Salvatore Russo was a predator who exploited the isolation and vulnerability of cloistered women. He used the language of spirituality to manipulate them into sexual relationships. The nuns were victims, and their belief that they were participating in something holy was a delusion born of trauma and coercion. This narrative is not wrong, but it is incomplete, because it does not account for the letters. It does not account for the fact that the nuns wrote in their own words, with clarity and conviction, that they had chosen this path, that they had sought Salvatore out, that they had asked him to help them find a way to God that the Church could not provide. It does not account for the fact that after the convent closed, after the scandal was buried, not one of the 9 nuns recanted. Not one said, "I was deceived." Not one sought legal recourse or public vindication. Instead, they kept the silence. And in that silence, they preserved the integrity of their belief. This is what makes the story so disturbing. Not the sex, not the pregnancies, but the fact that the nuns, even decades later, even knowing how the world would judge them, refused to disavow the experience. They held fast to the belief that what happened in that basement was sacred, that the children they bore were offerings, that Salvatore Russo was not a villain, but a conduit. And if we take them at their word, if we grant them the agency to define their own experience, then we are forced to ask a more unsettling question. Is it possible for something to be both deeply wrong and deeply meaningful? Can an act be sinful and sacred at the same time? The Catholic Church has a long history of mystics who claimed direct, unmediated experiences of God, experiences that bypassed the official channels of sacrament and hierarchy. Many of these mystics were women: Julian of Norwich, Teresa of Avila, Catherine of Siena, who described their encounters with the divine in language that was erotic, violent, ecstatic. The Church canonized some of them. It condemned others as heretics. The difference often came down not to the content of their visions, but to whether those visions could be contained within the institutional framework, whether they could be interpreted in ways that reinforced, rather than threatened, the Church's authority. The nuns of St. Catherine's were mystics of a kind, but their mysticism could not be contained. It was too embodied, too literal, too dependent on a man who existed outside the church's control. And so it was buried. But burial is not the same as erasure. The trunk still exists, the children still exist, and the question still exists. What do we do with a faith that produces both profound meaning and profound harm? Salvatore Russo's journal offers a partial answer. In one entry, dated March 1975, he wrote, "Sister Margarita came to me last night. She is the 8th. She asked me the same question they all ask. Will this bring me closer to God? And I told her the same thing I always tell them. I don't know. But if you believe it will, then maybe belief is enough. I think about my mother, about the choice she made to leave the convent, to have me, to live with the guilt of that choice for the rest of her life. I think about the children these women are bearing, the children who will grow up not knowing where they came from, not knowing that they were born from an act that their mothers believed was holy. And I wonder, am I giving these women what my mother never had, a way to choose both God and the world? Or am I just repeating her mistake in a different form? This is the question Salvatore could not answer, and it is the question that haunts the story still. Because the children, those 9 children, now in their 40s and 50s, are out there. They are living ordinary lives. They are teachers, nurses, accountants, parents. They do not know that they were born in secret, that their mothers were nuns, that their father was a hitman who believed he was serving God. They do not know that they are the living evidence of a theology that the church tried to erase. And perhaps that is the final cruelty of the story. Not that the nuns were silenced, but that the children were denied even the possibility of understanding their own origins, of deciding for themselves what their existence means. In 2003, a man named Samuel Brennan, adopted as an infant in 1969, began searching for his birth mother. He hired a private investigator. He filed petitions to unseal his adoption records. He was denied at every turn. The records, he was told, were sealed by court order and would remain sealed indefinitely. He died in 2019, never knowing that his mother was Sister Lucia Benedetti, never knowing that he was born from an act she believed was an offering to God. His daughter, continuing his search, recently contacted me. She wanted to know if I had any information about her grandfather's origins. I told her what I knew. I showed her the photograph of Sister Lucia, pregnant, wearing the silver crucifix. I read her the letter Sister Lucia had written to her son, the letter that began, "You were not a mistake. You were a prayer made flesh." She wept, and then she said, "I don't know if that makes it better or worse. Neither do I." The convent building still stands on Mulberry Street. It was sold in 1985 and converted into luxury condominiums. The basement where Salvatore heard confessions is now a gym. The room where the nuns prayed is now a yoga studio. The neighborhood has changed. Little Italy has shrunk, gentrified, become a tourist attraction. The old families are gone. The old silences have been replaced by new ones. But if you know where to look, you can still find traces. There is a small plaque on the building's exterior that reads, "Site of St. Catherine's Convent, 1923-1977. There is a cemetery in Westchester where 3 of the nuns are buried, their graves marked with simple stones that give only their religious names. No dates of birth, no hint of the lives they lived." And there is the diocesan archive, where the trunk waits in its labeled box, a time capsule of a faith that the church could not accommodate and could not destroy. I have requested access to the archive multiple times. I have been denied. The diocese maintains that the materials are sensitive and that opening them to researchers would violate the privacy of the individuals involved. But the individuals involved are dead or dying. The children are adults. The scandal, if it ever was one, is half a century old. What are they protecting? The institution? The faith? Or the possibility that the nuns were right? That what happened in that basement was not abuse, but a kind of devotion so radical that it exposes the inadequacy of our categories, the failure of our language to hold the full complexity of human belief? I think about Sister Lucia, kneeling in that circle of candles, offering herself to be unmade and remade. I think about Salvatore, a man who killed without hesitation, but who wrote in his journal, "I am afraid that I am damning them. I am afraid that I am saving them. I am afraid that there is no difference." I think about the children scattered across the country, living lives that are monuments to a secret they will never know. And I think about the question that Mother Agnesa asked Father Cormac, the question that ended their conversation and perhaps ended any possibility of understanding. Who are you to tell them they are wrong? It is a question that cuts both ways. Who are we to tell the nuns that their experience was not sacred? But also, who are we to tell the children that their origins do not matter, that the circumstances of their conception and birth are irrelevant to their identity? The story of St. Catherine's Convent is not a story about answers. It is a story about the questions we cannot escape, the contradictions we cannot resolve. It is a story about the human need for meaning, for connection, for a faith that feels real enough to touch. And it is a story about the cost of that need, the way it can lead us into beauty and into horror, sometimes in the same breath. In the end, the trunk is all we have. 9 photographs, 9 baptismal certificates, 9 letters written by women who believed they were participating in a mystery, and 9 children who will never read those letters, who will never know that they were born from an act their mothers called love and the world calls scandal. The truth, like the children themselves, remains scattered. The faith that created them remains unresolved. And the question that haunts the story, can devotion be both authentic and destructive? Can a man be both holy and damned? Remains unanswered. Maybe some stories are not meant to have endings. Maybe some questions are not meant to be resolved. Maybe the point is not to judge but to witness, to sit with the discomfort of a faith that exceeds our understanding, to acknowledge that the human heart is capable of believing things that the mind cannot justify and the world cannot forgive. Salvatore Russo died alone, a gun in his hand, his journal the only confession he ever made. The nuns lived and died in silence, their secret preserved by the very institution that condemned them. The children grew up not knowing they were born from a theology that had no name, a sacrament that had no blessing. And the trunk waits in the basement of the diocesan archive, a box labeled "Do Not Catalog," a repository of a faith too strange to acknowledge and too real to destroy. What do you do with a story like this? How do you hold it? How do you tell it without flattening it into scandal or sanctifying it into myth? I don't know. I know only that it happened. I know that 9 women believed they were serving God. I know that 1 man believed he was helping them. Know that 9 children exist because of that belief. And I know that the world has no category for what they created together. No language that can hold both the love and the violation, the faith and the damage. So we call it scandal. We bury it, we move on. But the photographs remain. The letters remain. The children remain. And the question remains. In the space between devotion and delusion, between the sacred and the profane, between the vows we make and the lives we live? Who decides what is holy?